listening to the Maritime Gardening Podcast, episode 119, brought to you by Vessi Seeds. Well, hey folks, it's the beginning of February 2022, and I thought I'd do one of these episodes today where I do a deep dive on a question a viewer asked me. And, when people ask me questions, I got a little thing I write them on, right? A little whiteboard, so I don't forget them. I used to write them, actually I have a computer file where I have them all stored, but I'm not looking at it all the time. By having them on this whiteboard, they're sort of in my face, so they don't go away. Anyway, this person asked me, and I can't remember who it was, so apologies for that. But the question was, can you talk about your top 5 successes and failures? And I thought about that for a little bit, and I thought, well, who wants to listen to most of the time I get success. You really don't learn a lot from success. So I thought maybe I'd just do a whole show on failures, so not just failures, but what I learned from failures. Okay, so and just as I start here, I want to talk for a split second about the concept of introspection. Webster's defines this as a process of examining your own thoughts and feelings. Whether that's self-examination, self-questioning, self-reflection, self-scrutiny, self-criticism in the sense of critique. Okay, so when this is done properly, it's a very useful tool. It has a positive effect on your life. Now, I'm not talking about dumping on yourself and kicking yourself when you're down and dwelling on your shortcomings and your errors and, I'm no good, everything I do stinks, what's wrong with me? Not that sort of thing. What I'm talking about is when you do something and it doesn't work, whatever that is. You lose a job, an important relationship ends in your life, you lose a friend, whatever. Sitting back and thinking, how did this happen? What did I do? What did I do wrong? I mean, sure, our knee-jerk reaction is it was everybody else, right? It was that guy, that's why the thing went wrong. Everybody's against me, right? But, you do have some agency in your life, right? So sometimes things go wrong and it is everyone else's fault or forces beyond your control. And sometimes it's because you just didn't do something that would have had a completely different outcome, right? And introspection can allow you to, if you're kind and gentle and forgiving with yourself, introspection can help you achieve growth by examining your decisions and your choices and your how you feel about things and maybe making coming up with a better plan for whatever you're trying to do going forward. And in the garden, this is very important, right? Because I've talked about this sort of thing before on the podcast, that gardening is a learning process, that it's good to check your ego at the door. And whenever things go wrong, you should, at the end of the garden season, write down everything went wrong and why you think it went wrong. And then spend the majority of the off season, the winter, reading about it, thinking about it, coming up with a plan for next year. If you do that over and over and over again, you'll either figure out how to grow the thing you had trouble growing, or just come to accept the fact that the thing you're trying to grow will not grow where you are, knowing that you've tried everything to make it work. Okay, so that's where I'm coming from with this show and the different successes and failures I'm going to talk about. Failure forces introspection. Introspection stimulates personal growth, right? Which means you're going to have more success in your garden. Okay, so these are in no particular order. Okay, so I'm going to talk, I think, first about some very specific things and then maybe move on to some general things. I keep notes every year on my garden and what I think, what went wrong and why I think it went wrong and what I should do next year. I usually write it down, sometime in the fall or whenever I get around to it. Okay, and then I try those things the following year and then see what happens. Right? That's how I've always worked my process. So when I look back through all of those notes, one of the most common thing I notice in the note is peppers. There's always Next year, try this with your peppers. Next year, try that with your peppers. Next year, try this with your, try this, try that. Every year, I just do not get the results I want with peppers. Um, the only way I've seemed to have had any success in growing them is when I use some sort of means to enhance the microclimate around them. Where I live, it's just not as sunny and as hot. It's more sun, really. It's basically the quality of sun that I get where I live. And I don't mean Canada, I don't mean Nova Scotia. I mean where I live, in particular in Nova Scotia. It's that specific. It's a foggy, overcast location to be, and windy, right? So fog, overcast, wind. None of these things are particularly good for peppers. Peppers like sun and heat. They like a lot of sun and a lot of heat. And this is just not one of the sunnier places. It's not a growing zone, as things go. I used to live in a part of Nova Scotia which is just sunnier and more pleasant in the summer. It just has a better growing. It actually gets colder in the winter, but in the summer it's just got more sun and more heat, more sunny, shiny sun days sort of thing, right? Whereas here we have more foggy days, overcast days. It's it's February, early February as I'm recording this, and it's raining outside today, right? Which happens here, and in a couple of days it'll be minus 19 or something like that. But it's raining today, right? So weather here is just bizarre. Um, anyway, peppers are one thing that I've never had a year where I am right now where I've felt successful in growing peppers. I've grown them. I've had, peppers that I can harvest and eat. But every time I grow peppers in my garden, I think, boy, I wish I'd grown something else in that spot. I would have got more of it. It may be the case that because my garden's so big, the peppers need an extreme amount of micromanagement. One of the drawbacks of having a vegetable, fruit, or whatever you want to call a pepper, in a garden is that it needs temperature management. You need to do whatever you can to raise the temperature around it. But on a day when it's really, really, really sunny, which we do get them once in a while, you can't have any of that microclimate. So you could have a pepper in a day in June, for instance. Okay, usually it's okay to have peppers planted out in June. Sometimes we still get frost in June, so it's iffy, right? There's years where if you were just planting it out, you would lose them unless you planted them in like end of June, right? We still have frost in June sometimes. It's really weird here. So you plant them out in mid-June and you put them under a dome or a hoop house or something like that. Now on a day where it's overcast, that's a good thing to do. On a day where it's really, really sunny, you could cook and kill them. It could get so hot in there. So it requires a lot of sort of micromanagement, and it's the sort of thing I don't like to have too many things to attend to in the. I like to just sort of stick stuff in the ground and let it go its own way and harvest it when it's ready. That's how I like to do my gardening. So it could just be that the effort required to grow peppers where I am in this particular location is just beyond my desire to do that kind of work for a particular thing. That's very possible. So I'm sure there's a way to do it and make it work. And maybe if I lived just a 20-minute drive inland, it would be a whole different story. I'm actually almost certain it would be. The climates are that variable when you're getting near the coast, the sort of open Atlantic coast of the ocean, where I am. Anyway, so peppers are one, and it may just be that I shouldn't bother growing them. I like them a lot though, and I use them a lot in my cooking. Right, they're sort of a key ingredient for a lot of things I like to make. So I'm inclined to think that one of these years I'm going to get the right variety. It's all going to come together for me. We'll see how that goes. Another epic fail was, and this happens from time to time, I'll plant carrots and they just won't germinate. I'll wait 3-4 weeks and they're just not there, right? Every once in a while, I'll have to replant my carrots like 2 or 3 times. Last year was a perfect example. 2021, I had to replant my carrots a few times to get them. And I think that's because I'm planting carrots early in the season, and I'm putting plastic domes over them to bring the soil temperature up so that they'll germinate. And there's particular days where it just gets too hot. And a carrot seed has a very sort of a particular band of temperature that seed needs to germinate. If you go too hot, it kills the whole process, and basically you've killed the seed. So I think I would probably be better off instead of trying to kickstart my carrots, just plant them when conditions seem right and just let them sort of go about their business naturally. The carrots that I did get to grow eventually did fine, and they get nice and big. So there was really no need to do all that extra work. So my takeaway from with carrots is stop freaking around with them and just plant them when they need to be planted and don't worry about it, sort of thing. Plant them mid-May. I like to try to plant them early April under plastic to get them going an extra month early so I can get them that much sooner. But maybe mid-May is just for where I am anyway, the better time. Generally speaking, mid-May. Um, Another epic fail was there was a year, I think it was 2015, where we just had this insane winter here. We got big snowstorms in March, really cold, just a bizarre year, 2015. I remember the ice on the lake behind my house was about 4 feet thick. There was 4 feet of snow everywhere. There's just a bizarre year. I've never seen a year like that since here, right? That was a unique year. I think when I lived another part of the province, we had a year like that as well. Maybe 2007, no, 2003 or 2004. I know. Anyway, 2015, I think they called it Snowmageddon or something like that. Anyway, what happened is we had a very cold winter like we normally do, and then we had all the snow. So the ground froze. Right now, there's some snow on the ground, but just a few days ago there wasn't. Right? It really happened on the weekend. Usually, what happens in this part of the province where I live is that it snows and then it rains and then it freezes, double digits below zero, freezing, and then it warms up and it snows and then it rains and then it freezes. So the ground turns to ice. And it's not really the end of the world because when April rolls around, there's not a lot of snow around. So everything, just the ice gradually thaws all the way down. In that particular year, we had all this frozen, basically the ground was ice. And then we had a big layer of snow on top of it. So when it started getting sunny and longer days and all that sort of stuff in late March, the sun wasn't hitting the soil. There's this huge, thick layer of snow. So the ground took forever to thaw. And I'd never experienced a growing season like that before. And nothing seemed to want to grow in my garden. I mean, I just couldn't get anything to happen. And I think really, and I'd only been at this location for a few years, right? But the previous year I had a good garden. The year before that I had a good garden. So I was really bewildered. Eventually, everything started to grow. But there was a period of about a month where I was like, what am I doing wrong? There must be some catastrophe. My soil must have collapsed in some way. What did I do wrong? And I hadn't done anything wrong. It was just the ground was too cold for things to germinate. Or if something germinated, the ground was so cold, it just grew unbelievably slowly. So it appeared as though my soil was lacking nutrients, that it needed something. But it was just cold. Just everything was cold. Even if you had stuff growing, like let's say the soil seemed thawed, there was like 5 inches of thaw, it would be like ice for another couple feet down. That year, there was still ice in the ground at the end of May. Like if you tried to dig into the ground in certain spots, there'd be ice, right? So I learned that year that, the kind of winter you have can really affect the growing season you have in spring if the conditions were such that the ground is frozen and the ground hasn't got any heat, right? So that year I learned about the importance of having a proper soil temperature, not just for germination, but if you're putting transplants in the ground, right? If you put a tomato in the ground and it's past you basically no more risk of frost, but is the soil warm yet, right? There could be no risk of frost, but the soil is really, really cold. And you put that tomato in the ground and the roots just go like, oh, this is too cold, and the tomato's wrecked, or it survives, but it's stunted and just not, never achieves its full potential as a plant. So yeah, soil temperature, weird winters affect growing seasons. That's something my whole garden was basically, it seemed like the whole thing was a failure that year. Like I was really questioning my ability to do this, and I'd been gardening, pretty seriously for a long time sort of thing, but that year it was really bad. And I just thought, man, and I just converted, like prior to that, I think 2012 or 2013, I converted to no-till. And so I was doubting that approach, but it was just, everything was too cold. Um, Potato scab. I love potatoes. I grow a lot of potatoes. I grow an inordinate number of potatoes, and because we eat them, I've got one box of potatoes left from all the potatoes I grew last year. We're down to one box. Um, so we enjoy eating them. They're a great thing to grow. They're easy to grow. But potato scab is something, in my previous location, I never had a problem with potato scab. Never. And when I started gardening at this location, um, if I plant anything that's not resistant to scab, it gets it bad. And so there's some really, really delicious varieties of potato, like Aramosa, or there's one called Superior, that it's just not worth it for me to plant those things in here. There's ways you can amend scab, but that problem just forced me to accept that there's certain things I just can't grow here. And I can only grow potatoes that are resistant to scab. I find the russet Burbank, Kennebecs are sort of the best. I grow Norlands here. They are scab resistant, but they're not scab proof. Like the Kennebec, the russet, and the russet Burbank are scab proof. They don't get scab, right? And there's other ones. Purple Chieftain's another good example. They're kind of scab resistant. I grow them. They might get a little bit of scab. Not too bad, right? And there's all kinds of things you can do. You can put all kinds of sulfur in the ground, all that sort of stuff. But for me, it's just easier to plant things that don't have a scab problem. They're just sort of immune to it. But scab's a failure I was forced to confront here. There are varieties of potato I just can't grow because they have no natural resistance to scab. And, I think it's a bacteria that causes that. It's in my soil. And sure, there's a pH that you can adjust the soil to like basically if the pH is really low. If you increase the acidity of your soil, which is decreasing the pH, you decrease the activity of that bacteria or its ability to affect potato. I don't want to go messing around with the acidity of the soil in my backyard. And moreover, this part of the world, soils tend to be acidic anyway. So, they tend to be on the acidic side of things, right? So I wouldn't want to make them, everything grows really well here. So I wouldn't want to make things more acidic and risk that. So it's better to just grow things that are resistant to scab. Next thing is the use of cold frames. Now you might say to me, like, what are you talking about? You've got cold frames everywhere. But what I'm talking about is permanent, immobile cold frames. The ones with it's like a box with a lid that opens up, right? There was a real craze about these things in the early 2000s, very popular. I actually found I didn't like them. It's not that I grew things in them and I could get tomatoes going early, and I mean they're very functional in many, many ways, but they're relatively small. And they can be useful as like transplanting incubators. It might be useful to have like one in a garden. But once plants get large, like if I had a cold frame, they can only be so big because you have to be able to access them, right? To manipulate the soil and to weed and deal with problems and whatever's going on in there, right? So usually the cold frame, 2 feet by 6 feet wide, 2 feet from front to back, 6 feet wide is about as big as you go. You got to put a door on that thing to open and close it. How much can you grow in something like that? When you consider the resources you have to allocate to make a box like that with an opening door and all that sort of stuff, and it really only has room for about like 4 kale plants or 4 tomato plants, right? And there's only certain things you can grow in the cold frames because the things you just wouldn't grow in there. You can't just grow anything in them, so your rotations don't make a lot of sense. It's kind of useful as an incubator, I suppose, but functionally in the garden, I got away from them and I just use these sort of little domes and all the different things I use in my garden, little portable, movable, microclimate type things. I just find that's better because I can put them wherever I want them. Any one of my gardens any year can be a cold frame if I want it to be. I prefer the versatility of that. And it's also cheaper because you don't need, to build this big box with all this stuff. It's a different sort of system. Not saying it can't work. It's just for what I do on the scale I'm doing it. It just wasn't practical for me. So that's cold frames. Cabbage. Last year I grew cabbage. And I mean, I got cabbage that I could harvest and use, but it was beset by pests on a scale like nothing I had ever seen. Now, was I regularly treating it with, like something like Safer's Endol, which is like an insecticidal soap sort of thing, or various, BTK, a bacteria that takes out not slugs, but caterpillars, and I didn't treat them with anything because in the previous year I didn't need to treat anything in my garden with anything. Well, I didn't need BTK in my garden the previous year. I did need a little bit of slug and snail killer, and I did need a little bit of insecticidal soap for a few problems, 2020. But really, I didn't have big pest problems. And I noticed a lot of wasps in the garden, so I thought, the wasps are taking care of my caterpillar problem, which they can do. I literally sit and watch plants with wasps flying in and flying away with caterpillars hanging onto them in their teeth, sort of thing, right? So I thought I was just sort of over that problem, but I wasn't. So I just watched so much of the cabbage when I went to harvest them, I had to like get rid of almost half of it because so much of the flesh was compromised by pests. So if I was going to grow, I'm just going to grow collards this year, 2022, because I find that I use them in much the same way, and for whatever reason, I find them more pest resistant in my location. But if I were to grow cabbage again, I'd have to be more proactive, either using nets or something, right? I'd have to do something. I would have to manage the pest problem for the cabbage in some way. Cabbage aren't going to manage it for me, which is what I prefer. So really not worth my time in this location. Another epic fail I had one year. This is really when I first started gardening here, is I didn't have a fence. I had like a little chicken wire fence about 2 feet high. And then one day I went out and like half my garden was gone. And, I mean, most people that grow in locations where there's deer and things like that, they listen to all the rubbish suggestions first. Oh, just pee around your garden. Put some of this, put some lemon juice or whatever, all these different things. People just sprinkle a little bit of this around, this magic dust or that magic dust. Just do that, and the deer won't come around because they're scared of it. Fences keep deer out. All this other stuff. You'd be surprised what they can get over if there's a good meal, right? Also, where I live, it rains all the time, so even if it doesn't rain, there's like a light, sort of dew. So, if I were to do a urination line around the perimeter of my garden, that'd be 200 feet. That'd be impressive in and of itself. I'd have to be doing that all the time. I'd have to do all my business out there just to keep that going. And of course, if it rained, the whole thing would be shut down, right? So it's just pointless, right? You need a fence. So I learned the hard way. Get a real fence around the garden and maintain that perimeter, or you're not going to have a garden. There's no garden with no fence. That's just the way it is. Apple tree. Another failure is apple tree. Okay. So I had my apple trees tip over. Both of them, all of them tip over. And if you, regular guest to have on the show, Stefan Sabkowiak, he's got great videos on choosing the location where you should plant an apple tree. And there's rules about where the sort of water line is in the soil, like where the water tends to gather in the soil. And you don't want an apple tree in water. You do not want to plant an apple tree in soil that's overly watery. It's the best way of putting it. And uh, and that's the kind of soil I have. It's just not where my garden is not a good place for planting apple trees. Now I thought to myself, well, I mean, in nature, rules get broken all the time, and I'm sure there are wild apple trees growing in places where the soil conditions are such that shouldn't be planted there. And that is true. And probably one in 1,000 of them grow well. And the other 99,000 tip over like mine. So you get really soft, wet, soggy soil, and you got a really windy day, and the roots get pulled right out of the ground. That's what happened with basically all my apple trees. The only one that of my original apple trees that has survived is basically tipped over, and I pruned it so it start growing back up again. So it literally is tipped, and it just kept going. All right, the next thing is not thinning. One of my epic fails every single season, it seems, is that there's something I don't thin that I wish I had thinned. This is a really rookie mistake to make where you just think more plants is better when every plant needs the space it needs to achieve its full potential, be its healthiest, grow as well as it can grow. There's depending on your goals, there's different concentrations, densities that you can have with plants. But as a general rule, spacing matters. And you can get away with closer spacing if you have rich soil and you're a home gardener. I mean, a lot of the spacing suggestions on seed packs are for like farms and agriculture and machines and working. So I mean, you can break the rules a bit. There's a limit to how much you can break the rules when it comes to thinning. And there's a concentration of plants that just either it's such a safe place for pests to be, you can just have more pest damage than you should. Or if you got root vegetables, they're pushing against each other, and to some extent root vegetables can sort of jostle around and find their own space, but there's a limit to that. And of course, the sun is up there and everything else is below the sun. If you've got something casting shade on something else, it just can't do its best. So you have to be, judicious. You have to be ruthless. You've got to make the most of the vegetables so that they can have the space they need to grow, to achieve their full size, achieve their potential, all that sort of stuff. And if you keep putting that off, you're not working in the plant's best interest. And every year it seems like the time to thin the plants is when the black flies or the mosquitoes are sort of at their peak. And I'm just reluctant to go out there and do it. But there's workarounds for all these problems. And, for me, really, the solution is to go outside at like 5, 6 a.m. early in the morning before the flies are really active. Black flies especially, they really don't become active till like, I'm scratching just thinking about it. But they don't really, this the season when they're around, sometime in May till sometime in June, July. They really don't show up until like 8 or 9 in the morning till it starts getting warm. So you have this great window of time. You can go out early in the morning. There's nothing around. And then in July, we switch over to mosquitoes, which aren't such a big deal. They can be heavy where I am, but horse flies and deer flies are horrendous. So there's this period early in the morning where I have to get out in the garden if to do anything, especially like thinning, where you're bent over, both your hands are involved. You really can't sort of swat. You're stationary. You're very stationary. So that's really one of the things I tend to get wrong. I just tend to not do it, or just I'll be inside having my coffee. I should be out there right now, but I don't. I should be thinning. If you want to get good results, you need to thin. And I always thin. I thin a lot of things, but I could always do better. That's always the case. So thinning. And I guess this leads to the final topic, and that is procrastination. One of the things I get wrong every year is just putting things off and putting things off and putting things off. I think I'm better than most at not doing that in my garden, but there's always room for improvement. I always have regrets. I talk about the introspection. I always, when I look at my garden at various stages in the year, I said, I should have done that 2 weeks ago. I really should have done that 2 weeks ago, whatever it is, Or there's something I should have thinned those. Look at the size of them. They could have been twice that size. Oh, I got a problem with a pest now. I should have dealt with that. I should have pruned that. I should have dealt with that thing 2 weeks ago. It's always 2 weeks ago. I should have done something. And all these things I'm not doing are things that take 5 or 10 minutes to do. They're not like, big, elaborate, complicated things. They're things that are very easy. They don't take a lot of time. It's not a big time commitment to do those things. So it's just one of those things you gotta have you don't need a lot of discipline, but a degree, a smidgen of discipline to address those things that need to be done for the better good of your garden. And you planted the garden with a goal in mind, and then midway through the season, you lose track of that goal, and your mind's just on that day and how you're feeling and whether you're tired or whatever. And to whatever extent it's possible, your ability to keep that goal in mind of the results, so that you stay on top of things. You don't let things. Sure, you can procrastinate a day or two. I mean, it should not feel like a job, like work, where there's all these things. There's a list of things you have to do, and you have to do them on time. Who wants that? I mean, your garden should be relaxing. But you still have some things you got to do. You can put them off a day or two. I mean, you can't put them off indefinitely. So that's another thing I get wrong. A failure of mine is procrastination in the garden, always. No matter how on top of things I am, I could be more on top of things, do a better job of it. So yeah, there's the list. I think we got through it. That's 10 things that failure. I mean, it's a strange word, but basically things I got wrong that I look back and say, oh, I should have done that differently, and things I learned from what's that term, teachable moment, that sort of thing. Things I wish I'd done a little bit differently, and had I done them differently, I think the outcomes would have been different. And things I try to remind myself to do a better job of in the coming year. So that's the podcast for this month. I hope you found some little useful bits in there, and give you a few things to chew on. If you like what I'm doing here and you want to help keep it going, check out my sponsor, Vessi Seeds. If you want to help support the show, and Vessi Seeds sells something that you need, buy it from them using my coupon code GAVS22, and you'll get free shipping on your order, as long as there's a pack of seeds in the order and there's not an oversized item in the order. You can check out the description of this podcast, the description box or the write-up, and the details are there. But the coupon code is GAVS22. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting, and if you did, please like, share, subscribe. And until next time, get out there, get at it, have fun in your garden.